Okay, so I think we're ready to start the podcast. Welcome, everyone. Good day. My name is Keith Bernard. I'm a senior technology analyst with the IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D program. And I'm going to introduce to today's webinar. It's Beyond levelised cost of electricity, value of technologies in different generation and grid scenarios. The presenter will be Professor Niall McDowell. Before, though, I hand over to Niall, I just would like to give you a brief introduction of the of IEA GHG. So, our full name, as I've mentioned, IEA Greenhouse Gas R&D Program, but mostly known as IEA GHG. The obligatory disclaimer: our views and findings and publications do not necessarily represent the views of the policies of the IEA Secretariat or its individual member countries. We are related to the IEA through an umbrella legal agreement as all other technology collaboration programs. We've been part of the IEA's Energy Technology Network since 1991. We have 37 members, 21 countries represented, including the Coal Industry Advisory Board, OPEC, and the European Commission. Our members set the strategic direction and our technical program mainly in the meetings that we hold twice yearly. And importantly, we're a technology-based information organization. We inform policy, we do not define policy. That is for our mother organization, the IEA Secretariat, and we are not lobbyists. We're a technology-based organization. What do? Our focus is almost entirely on carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We assess mitigation options, track capture technology developments and cost, monitor geological storage performance, and provide our members and policy audience with independent technology input. Our main activities are technical studies, international. We run a number of CCS networks. Many of you may be involved in one or other of the networks. We organise two main conferences: GHG 15, which is held every 2 years, and the next one will be held in March. And hopefully many of you will be, or most of you will be registered or will register shortly to join that conference. And later next year, we will have our 6th post-combustion capture conference. That one will be held in the UK, and more details of that will be forthcoming. As well as that, we hold a summer school each year, with the next one being in Indonesia in July next year in July. We peer review various journals and reports, and we're engaged with other international bodies. And here is a slide showing our membership. You can see the around the center there, we have the flags of our member countries and organizations, and around the outside we have our industry and research organization membership. So there are 18 country members including including OPEC and the European Commission, and 19 industry organizations. And below the black line are international organizations that we cooperate very closely with. So back to the webinar now, and we'll move on shortly. First, to mention that we've scheduled 1 hour for this webinar, and we will be taking questions at the end. So if you have any questions, please send them to us through the write your questions in the box and send them through to us, and we'll work through as many as we can at the end. The presenter is, as I mentioned before, Professor Niall McDowell, but he will also be joined by Ilga Pratima, who was a lead author and third-year PhD student at Imperial College. And Niall will say a little more about that. Niall McDowell, Professor Niall McDowell, needs little introduction to you. He's a professor in energy systems engineering at Imperial. He's a chartered engineer and fellow of both the IChemE and the Royal Society of Chemistry. His research is focused on understanding the transition to a low carbon economy. Since 2010, he has published more than 100 peer-reviewed scientific papers at the molecular unit operation, integrated process, and system scales in this context. And his work has been presented more than 100 times at conferences in the UK, EU, North America, Middle and Far East. As I mentioned, I'm sure that many of you will be familiar with Niall. So without any further ado, I'll hand over to Professor McDowell to the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Can I just confirm before I move on that my screen is properly showing?
Yes, it looks fine.
Yes, it is.
Fantastic, thank you. So thank you, Keith, for the very kind introduction and for the opportunity to present here today. And also thank you for Yoga for taking the time out to contribute to this. It's been fantastic having you as a co-author for this important study. I think that this question, just to lead off, this question around levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE, as we're going to talk about during the presentation, this question's been around for quite some time, and it's a real privilege for myself and you to contribute to this conversation. And before I go any further, I'd like to thank you, Keith, particularly and all your colleagues at IEA GHG, for all your support and help in delivering this study. So hopefully it is useful to the community. In terms of the overview of the presentation, what I'd like to do is start out with just provide a quick project overview. What I want to do is go into a little bit of the origin and background of LCOE to think about where it came from and the rationale for its original development. I will mention briefly some of the existing alternatives to LCOE, and then I will spend a reasonable amount of time going through the metric that Yoga and I developed in this work before presenting some conclusions. So in terms of background and context, this idea of LCOE, it is quite ubiquitous in the evaluation of power technologies around the world. And whilst people have been criticizing it and been very enthusiastic, I guess you might say, to describe its shortcomings, I mean, it's important to remember that it was perfectly adequate in the context of a 20th century electricity system where all of the technologies were basically homogeneous in their layout. However, what it basically does as an option is recognize a very limited number of grid services, and the reality is that electricity systems are very complex, and they're becoming increasingly complex, and they require a portfolio of what are called grid services. So this includes things like system inertia and frequency response and so on. And not all technologies in the heterogeneous 21st century grid provide all of these grid services in an equivalent way. And therefore, the position of LCOE as the sort of metric of choice in the context of this grid is increasingly untenable. So if on the one hand we have, and I think you can see, if on the one hand we have an LCOE which has this reputation of being very, very simple, in that we take one particular technology, we specify its capital costs, some operating costs, and this allows us to quickly evaluate what the cost of electricity comes from. It's very widespread in terms of its usage. On the other hand, we have some of the system technology or system value concepts where we use large complex models to evaluate the role which different technologies might play within a given electricity system and how they interact with all the other power plants, things like economic dispatch unit commitment and so on. This is all fantastic, but evaluating this system value using the more sophisticated models requires quite a lot of complex tools. And the aim of this project really was to think about how could we capture as much of the simplicity and tractability and intuitiveness of the LCOE type system, but just try and bring in some of the broader system metrics of the more complex models. So that was very much what was driving this this piece of work. And so to take a further step back and we think about where this concept of LCOE came from in the first place, we have to go all the way right back to the latter part of the 20th century. And following the 1960s and early 70s, when energy prices were really quite stable all around the world, we had the period in the late 70s, early 80s of energy crises, which ushered in an era of really quite significant energy price volatility. And in the late 1970s, in 1978, the PURPA, the Public Utilities Regulatory Policies Act, was passed. And this was obviously in the United States, and it focused first and foremost on promoting energy conservation, so reducing demand, to switch away from imported energy towards domestic sources of energy, so again, a national security angle, and also the importance of what were referred to then as non-fossil sources of energy. So this meant nuclear power, as well as the more conventional renewable sources that we think about a lot today, wind and solar power. And this led to the extension of what was then called the total life cycle cost, the TLC, to the LCOE metric. So total life cycle cost is simply the total cost spent for owning, operating, and maintaining an asset throughout the course of that asset's life, or perhaps more importantly, the investor's period of interest. So very simply, TLC is the sum of investment in any given time, the maintenance cost and fuel costs, again, in any given time, divided by a discount rate. So, anyone will quite quickly see how this is related to a levelized cost of electricity, and indeed TLC is extended quite quickly simply by dividing it by the discounted electricity production, again, over the life cycle. And what's fantastic about this metric, LCOE, is that it is really very simple. We're taking a bunch of numbers, adding them up, dividing them by another number, and getting an answer. Very, very simple. And in this simplicity lies its sort of beguiling nature, because in fact, this is not as simple as it might first appear. We have to think about, for example, when this capital gets spent and how the maintenance periods will be scheduled over the course of the lifetime of the plant, and then similarly, what fuel prices might be likely to do over the period, and then embedded in the electricity or the energy produced by the facility, we then have assumptions, a priori assumptions about what kind of behavior or load factor that the power plant might actually experience throughout its life. And so these are quite significant embedded upfront assumptions that kind of get passed by. So what's important about this is that LCOE then, it appears to be tractable to hand calculation. And in reality, I think that this is not quite true. And at least sort of, fairly sophisticated spreadsheet level calculations are in fact required. And importantly, LCOE ignores ancillary services that become increasingly important as the grid becomes increasingly heterogeneous. And it is therefore not really an appropriate tool for system design in the 21st century context. Importantly, this last point is not new. I mean, people have been discussing the shortcomings of LCOE for quite some time, and there are reports and studies going back several decades on this point. So, there is nothing, particularly insightful in that observation. Some key features of LCOE. So to begin with, the role is predetermined. So, you have to assume as you're calculating the LCOE, if your technology is going to be base load or load following or peaking capacity or what. It can capture the lifetime cost of the technology for a given service, not just a particular year. So that's really helpful. It does then help you understand what the lifetime competitiveness of your technology is relative to other incumbent technologies. You can input, and again, this is where you move away from a sort of a simple calculation that you might think to do on a piece of paper. In a spreadsheet format, you can think about how fuel prices evolve or how carbon prices might evolve as we try to decarbonize our systems. So this metric can capture that level of complexity. And importantly, it uses the same unit as the price of electricity. So ultimately, it's dollars per megawatt hour or whatever. And this is therefore perceived as being very, very, very accessible to a wide range of stakeholders, from policymakers to technology designers, academics, and other end users. So it's quite useful in that context. However, and probably the most important drawback, I think, of LCOE at this point is that it calculates cost homogenously. So, in other words, it doesn't consider the temporal value of energy. It also can't explicitly appreciate other system services, so ancillary services like flexibility and its dispatchability. And dispatchability, for example, is something that we are coming to view as being increasingly important as time goes by. One of the reasons that this is important is that that evaluating LCOE, it does require this a priori assumption, which can lead us to some potentially misleading conclusions on, for example, the cost or the level of policy support that a new technology might require. Importantly, for any given portfolio of energy technologies, there is another portfolio of different grid services. So whether it's flexibility, voltage control, frequency response, ramp rates, and so on. And as illustrated by this graphic, not all technologies provide A, all of the services, or B, in the same way. So again, this heterogeneity is really, really important when thinking about energy systems design. As I mentioned before, there have been several alternatives proposed to LCOE starting since the 1990s and moving on since then. One that's achieving quite a lot of attention recently is what's referred to as the value adjusted levelized cost of electricity. That was proposed by the IEA a couple of years ago. And what we refer to in this study is the levelized cost of electricity services. And I'll explain more about that in a few minutes. What we then did as part of this study was to think about, for each of the different technology or alternatives to LCOE that we had, we thought about the different types of technology that you could include, the different types of grid services that each metric provided, the way in which each metric considered time, and then also finally the complexity of the different metric. And you can see that, for example, it is again quite a heterogeneous field. There is no one metric, including our own, that is green across the entire board. But what we really wanted to try and do was to take a step forward from LCOE in terms of sophistication, but to try and retain as much as possible the complexity. And so this is what we think we've managed to do with the power generation screening curve approach. So the first thing that we needed to do was to think about, or to better understand, which electricity grid services are the most valuable. So some years ago, we developed the ESO, the Electricity Systems Optimization Framework, as part of a previous IEA GHG project. And this gave, initially, we thought about a pretty basic set of constraints, thinking about electricity demand, reserve requirements, and then the requirement for system inertia. And different technologies provide different levels of inertia, and thus we we thought that we had a good handle on what we needed in terms of grid services. However, what we wanted to do now was to expand the model to include primary, secondary, and tertiary reserve services. And then what we were then able to do was use this tool to evaluate which of the different types of services, so capacity, power generation, inertia, and the different kinds of reserve service, which of these services was the most valuable to the system. And then this would then in turn tell us what we needed to include in our final metric. So again, what we found here was that whilst all services have some level of value, only a few are particularly valuable or particularly significant. And first and foremost there were energy and capacity. Other system services were implied by having these. In order to improve the acceptability and transparency of the concept that we wanted to develop, we decided that this would include only significant or these key services, and to try and make our new concept as incremental as possible from an LCOE baseline, on the basis that, a bit like in thermodynamics, people will start from an ideal gas model and they will perturb from there. So this is basically what we did. We adopted what's called a power generation screening curve to evaluate both thermal technologies, and then we extended it to evaluate renewable energy technologies and energy storage as well. So, as you may be familiar, this is a power technology screening curve system. So, for example, you've got the annual cost in, say, units of pounds per kilowatt on the y-axis, and then the full load hours on the x-axis. And so for any thermal technology, its system cost in this context can be approximated by a simple y equals mx plus c straight line. If you have a large y intersection, for example, as in the case of nuclear power, you have a technology that's capex dominated. If you have a large slope, however, you have a technology that's opex dominated, as in the case of an open cycle gas turbine. And importantly, for any given technology, its overall operating cost over a year is the combination, or over its lifetime will be the combination of its capital cost plus its annual operating costs. So how this works is we first of all identify the different intersect points. So for example, here, we would have nuclear power running for somewhere between 7,300 and 8,760 hours. So let's call that 8,000 hours a year. And then we identify how many hours that translates to using a load duration curve, and what in turn that means in terms of the share of peak load, so how much capacity of that technology we need to meet that level of demand. And that tells us how much of what capacity of this technology we need. After that, we look for the next intersect, which in this case happens to be a gas CCS type technology. And that gets us to the next level of capacity. So in this model system, using a UK type load duration curve, we need an amount of gas CCS. Again, some unabated gas. And then finally, some open cycle gas turbine to meet peak demand over the course of the year. And it's important to highlight that this is for one given set of inputs and one given set of assumptions around carbon prices, fuel prices, and so on. And this really matters. What you're basically doing as you move through is minimizing the area under this curve. So and that is essentially how you design an electricity system in short form. And again, because we see that the nuclear power plant operates for a large number of hours, we can assign to it a baseload type role. The gas plant operates at an intermediate number of hours, so this is more mid-merit. The combined cycle gas turbine, the unabated gas plant, this operates more in load following manner. And then finally, the open cycle turbine operates in peak load on the basis of the hours available to it. So this is all quite intuitive, and so far so good. And this looks really quite like something that we might expect to see in the 20th century quite normally, although perhaps without the gas CCS. Coal is excluded here, not for any particular reason. We're just thinking about the UK type system going forward. So the challenge is then that traditional approach, or the conventional approach to the screening curve, it doesn't evaluate the role that an intermittent renewable energy source like wind or solar power might play, nor does it incorporate solar power, energy storage. So what we chose to do was to add, and we can't obviously add renewable energy to this screening curve in this way. So what we chose to do instead was to assume that because renewable energy tends to have a near zero marginal cost, it will dispatch ahead of pretty much everything else in the system. So therefore, the impact of deploying a given capacity of a given type of renewable energy will change the shape of the load duration curve that needs to be met by other technologies. And so what you can see here is again a UK type system using, I think, onshore wind deployed at different percentages of the peak demand. And you can see then when there's no wind, obviously it's a completely normal grid, and you can add up to 10, 20, 30% of peak load of wind before some of the wind starts to get curtailed. So importantly, these kinds of data are pretty readily available. We tend to use a source developed by one of our colleagues here at Imperial College, Ian Steffel. We use the Renewables Ninja data set. There are others, but using this readily available data, we can then understand how much in a given renewable technology will dispatch in a given location. And so we combine that information with a system-specific load duration curve. And so far, this is the only additional complexity over and above an LCOE type system. We need all of the same types of information, plus a little bit more information about load duration curves and the availability of wind or solar power in that system on an hourly basis. So for dispatchable thermal plants, it's a completely traditional screening curve method. So the same linear piece, so fixed up. So the annual cost of a given technology includes the annualized capital cost, the fixed OPEX, and also the variable OPEX. And again, simple linear equation that can be implemented in a spreadsheet quite fast. For non-dispatchable renewable energy or intermittent renewable energy, so it's, again, as I mentioned, it's capital intensive. So pretty much all of the cost goes onto that y-intercept. It has near zero operating cost, so no slope as seen through the lens of the previous slide. And what we assume it does then is it acts as a load reducer technology. So as I said, it modifies the load duration curve. However, because wind or solar power, it tends to be curtailed when available generation is greater than demand. What we in turn do is we adjust its annual cost in line with the level of curtailment. So in other words, the ratio of what we call its effective capacity factor with curtailment, so to its capacity factor without curtailment. And then here, further, the capital recovery factor, the CRF, is capital recovery factor, so that allows us to take into account the cost structure of a given project, capacity factor without curtailment, and ECF being the effective capacity factor. For energy storage, so storage is a form of dispatchable power, but it does require electricity from other technologies. Primarily, we assume renewable sources in order to provide value to the system. Importantly, it requires time to charge and also to discharge. We assume that charging and discharging takes the same amount of time, and therefore its maximum load duration is as much as 1/2 of 1 year. So in other words, for every hour you want to discharge, you have to spend an hour charging. So again, this is an assumption that we've made in these worked examples that I'm showing you here. In reality, as a user, you can change this assumption. In addition, obviously, the maximum load duration is limited by the duration of renewable energy generation that's being curtailed, which in turn needs to be discounted by the round-trip efficiency of the technology. Importantly, what this lets us do is articulate an annual cost of the electricity storage technology, again, as a simple linear equation. So what we're seeing here is a UK system incorporating an onshore wind electricity storage with average UK capacity factors for onshore wind. And what we can see is, as you deploy more and more wind, the potential for curtailment increases. So the resources down here this is where the wind will start to get curtailed. And we can see that when a certain amount of capacity is deployed, initially that the wind will be used without any curtailment, and as you deploy more and more of it, at some point, the cost of a given capacity will then become greater than the marginal cost of gas CCS in this example, and this translates to here approximately 63% of peak demand, which we are then able to decide. We can then figure out how much of peak of energy for the system will be provided by wind, 63%. The next piece will be gas, unabated gas, so gas CCS, unabated gas, and open cycle gas turbines. And again, then from the low duration curve, we can then ascertain that in order to provide 63% of power, we need 163% of peak load capacity. So in other words, we need, unsurprisingly, more capacity, from offshore wind, onshore wind, to meet 63% of demand. So this is how we then incorporate the wind into the system. Following a similar approach, we can incorporate solar PV. Again, unsurprisingly, in the UK, we need quite a lot of PV capacity to meet 26% of total energy, so really quite a lot. And then, whereas in the case of offshore wind, in order to meet 40% of energy demand, we only need about 60%, 73% of peak load. And again, we start to see nuclear power coming back into the mix. But what this gives us is a pretty intuitive and simple tool, which allows us to think about different technologies in a pretty complicated mix. Again, a user in using this in this metric will have the flexibility and freedom to assign their own capital costs, operating costs, and so on, and derive from this what they think will be the best or the cost optimal system configuration. In terms of conclusions, then, so what we do find is that all electricity grid services are valuable, but capacity and energy services are key. This modified screening approach that we developed in this report, it enables the evaluation of thermal technologies, so whether that's nuclear power or coal, gas, unabated or abated, as well as renewable technology. So this could be hydro or offshore wind, and then energy storage, solar power. So all of these can be incorporated. Where we think that this concept has some particular utility is that it can be used to estimate the level of economic deployment, and stepping away from needing to assume a load factor early on. So depending on how much of the technology that you deploy, it then changes the actual capacity factor that you're likely to see comes out of this analysis as a result. So this in turn provides some insight into the optimal role of that the technology can play. Importantly, this reduces the need for a priori assumptions in this space. And whilst the optimal share, as you've seen, of renewable energy can be significant, the role of dispatchable plants remains critical. So that's everything that's incorporated in the report that we have delivered to IEA GHG. But what I wanted to do next was share with you what we've done with this work since we provided it to Keith. So we were conscious that these system modeling tools, as they so stand, are relatively complex and relatively inaccessible to people who don't have a lot of time on their hands. So we've converted this screening curve application into what we call an ESO Lite application. So these are a few screenshots that another member of our group, Augustin Prado, has been developing. So this is very much a beta version. But what you'll see is that, for a given system, you can specify your incumbent design. So you can say, okay, what does our country look like today in terms of installed capacity? And what our task will be is to think about how we might use this screening curve approach to design an optimal configuration for some time in the future, let's say 2050. So we can pick from a drop-down menu any one of a number of different countries. We're building this up. So far, we're looking at Europe, some bits of the United States, other parts of the rest of the world, bits of Australia, and Vietnam, South Korea, and so on, Indonesia as well. This screening curve, using the inputs that you've seen, it allows us to then think about what the screening curves for your particular system looks like, what the low duration curve looks like, and also what your incumbent system, what the structure of the incumbent system is. What the user can then do, so sorry, we've changed from Spain to the UK here, is specifying which technologies are available to our system. So for example, in the UK, we might untick coal because the likelihood of building unabated coal going forward is low. But what we can also then do is use these slider tools to decide how much of a given technology we want to include. And then we can think about building on some other work that we've done recently with Piera Patrizio, where we incorporate jobs and GVA indications of technology deployments. We can think about how the cost of the system, how the gross value added, and also the CO2 emissions of the system vary with your design scenario relative to the BAU, and also then break down the jobs and economic impact by different sector of the economy. Obviously, this is a pretty flexible tool, so we want to be able to think about the cost of different types of fuel, carbon intensity of the different fuels, carbon prices, technology discount rates, and then obviously the specific inputs in terms of, for example, the capital cost, fixed and variable O&M, lifetime CO2 capture rate where that's relevant, power, thermal efficiency, and then obviously the type of fuel that you use. So that's everything that I wanted to say for today. So I think, Keith, I'm happy, Yoga and I will try and take any questions that we have from the audience for the remainder of the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niall, and thank you, Yoga, for excellent piece of work there and presentation. It was particularly interesting for me, I guess, to see how you have further developed that and the work that you have brought on, that you've undertaken since you completed the study. We have some questions from our listeners, so I'll put them to you as they have come through. First one, it would be interesting to put high enthalpy geothermal energy in the mix. Any gut feel what the impact would be?
So again, massively depends on the national context, both in terms of the availability of geothermal, that obviously varies around the world, but also the structure of the electricity system. Geothermal is, an inherently capital-intense technology, but then relatively low OpEx. So in some senses, it might be in competition with nuclear power in terms of the role that it might play in the system. What we observe is that in systems like, for example, the UK, and these are insights from some work that Yoga did with the CIAB last year, in systems like the UK or ERCOT in the US, Texas, where you have a strong availability of renewable energy, the system primarily needs low capital intensive, highly flexible or dispatchable technologies. Whereas if you move to places that are more like Poland, baseload type technologies become more important. So that's a long way of saying that in some systems, geothermal could be very valuable, in others, perhaps not so much.
Thank you, Niall. Next question. Can you comment on the limitations of Valco relative to this new method?
I'd draw that on. I think they all have different strengths. I think we think that this approach has its own merits, but then Valco is, I think, a really useful addition to the literature as well. I think that there is as yet no clear winner, or no clear successor maybe to LCOE. I think all of these different metrics have their strengths, but also their weaknesses. And as
have you seen any encouraging signs that people are open-minded or taking up these alternatives?
Yeah, so I guess in terms of encouraging signs, whenever I've been speaking with folks, here in the UK and in the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, or from the US Department of Energy, I think that there's a broad realization from officials, but also elected representatives and political appointees, that LCOE is not an appropriate metric. So that's very encouraging. And then I think so far Valco has been used in quite a few different venues. So I think the conversation is hopefully moving on.
Okay, next question. Does the model include risks around grid resilience as different forms of electricity generation come on and offline?
Yoga, would you like to say anything about this one?
I don't think that in this framework that we have developed, we can include that, because again, the purpose of the development of this approach is to find as comprehensive a method that can measure as comprehensive as possible the value of technology in electricity systems. But again, we don't really want to get into too much details in our framework, because it becomes more inaccessible to whether user in our community. And it's just like this metric or this approach is built for some simplified purpose for this technology evaluation.
Thank you. Next question. In the ESO Lite app, you mentioned it calculates GHG emissions. Does this include emission slippage and/or full life cycle on the construction of an energy type within the system?
Yeah, so it's not an it's not a life cycle analysis tool. It really is an encapsulation of the work that we've done with this report. In terms of slippage and so on, that is really up to you as a user. So for example, I'm not sure if you can still see the screen, but where the user defines the carbon intensity of a given fuel, a user could define that to mediate a total GHG intensity articulated in tons of CO2 equivalent per megawatt hour. So if you wanted to, you could.
Thank you. Next question. Does different generation in your title refer to technologies at different levels of development, TRL? It will be useful for evaluating new technologies.
Yeah, the unicorn hunt. So absolutely, yeah. Again, in the context of this work, if you have a new type of technology, once you have enough information, for example, using Andrea Ramirez ex-ante technology evaluation approach, once you have enough information to assign some reasonable numbers to the capital cost, to its fixed and variable O&M, to understand its life cycle and CO2 emissions and so on, you can then quite quickly get some indication of how your technology will fare relative to the incumbent system.
Thank you. Next question, and last question I think that we have here. Does this approach complement or compete with enhanced LCOE as referenced in the recent Bayes cost of generation report?
I haven't read that report as thoroughly as I might have, so I don't really have a good answer for that. I suspect that it complements.
Okay, wasn't the last. There is another one here. As the grid matures and evolves with more renewable technologies, much of the volatility will get arbitraged away. Might we end up back with LCOE?
Interesting question. I guess we will see in due course. Who knows?
Okay, that is the end of our questions. So I will take this opportunity to thank you again, Professor McDowell and Yoga Prathama, for an interesting and very useful study. We were very pleased to be able to contract this study out, and we're very happy with the results that with the study that you undertook. And so it's a very useful study within our bank of studies that we undertake each year. So thank you very much, both of you, and thank you for everyone for listening in, and have a very good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, and thank you for the opportunity to speak here today, and thank you to all of the attendees for the interesting questions.